You're listening to INTERZONE Pod, and on today's show, I'm talking to Kat Clay. Hello, Kat. Thank you very much for coming on.
Hi, Gareth. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to actually start off by sort of asking you, like in your email signature, you are writer photographer, and sort of where did how do those two things sort of relate to each other, and was it photography first or writing first?
It's chicken or the egg situation, I'm sure. I mean, I've been kind of obsessed with technology since I was a little kid. My dad was an IT manager and trained in IT when, IT was punch cards. And so from a really early age, we had, Mac computers. I remember playing Scarab of Ra as a 3-year-old and being terrified by the video game that, if you look it up now, it's pretty funny. But for me, my dad has always been into photography. So we had a darkroom growing up. And it's actually something that comes into my writing practice a lot, that I never think that there is one way to tell a story. And it's really important to me that there's no kind of snobbishness around art forms. Like, you don't get stories just out of reading books. You don't get stories. I guess I'm not a storytelling purist. There are those people who are just always like, books are the purest form of storytelling. Audiobooks are terrible. It's not pure. But I'm the opposite of that. I think there's a really common thread between photography and writing, is that they're both telling stories in different mediums. And it's actually one of the things, I'm really glad you asked this question, because one of the things I'm working on and have been working on for several years is a short story collection where every story is a different aspect of photography. So the Black Box Killer, which is an INTERZONE, has an element of photography in it, just a small one. But the whole idea is that that collection will tell the story of photography from the 1860s to the near future. And so that's a great passion of mine. And that's my roundabout way of saying I love all art.
Well, starting with that kind of technology side, you mentioned before the show, you mentioned that you were sort of playing around with Chat GPT, and I also kind of like back in December, I was kind of quizzing it and doing all those kind of stereotypical things where you sort of you ask it silly questions and see what it says. But yeah, there is something sort of fascinating about the way these technologies can be used to tell stories, right?
Yeah, and playing with GPT-3 has been really entertaining this week because, I do understand the complexities for artists and writers coming towards these new technologies, but I'm also really intrigued by what they can do for us and how they can serve us and how they can also make our life easier. So apart from using GPT-3 to write a letter to the council the other day, I actually was using it to generate story ideas, and I wanted to see how it would deal with kind of complex story ideas, or kind of how it could actually generate kind of story prompts. And then I was kind of, amusing myself by trying to plan a career as a best-selling writer, because that's a thing you do. And I was asking it to give me novel ideas in the vein of this famous author. So the most entertaining one was certainly, write me a synopsis for a novel in the style of China Medieval. And that just basically gave me a story about cultists running amok in East End London, and a group of scientists and technologists trying to stop them while strange and weird things were happening in the city. And I'm like, look, that's not far off.
and it's a starting point for something, for sure.
Yeah, and I think look, it's limited at the moment. I think when you get into those niceties and those kind of really specific instances where you want more detail, like I was saying, hey, give me some short story ideas for hard science fiction stories in the style of Isaac Asimov or Ted Chiang, and trying to see if it could pass the difference between those two styles of science fiction writers. It certainly did give me more relational varieties on the Ted Chiang stories. But I don't think it was ever going to give me anything so specific that wasn't based on existing material. And I think that's the thing to remember with AI. It's a iteration machine. It basically iterates what it's been programmed with, and a lot of the time that's not going to be the whole text of a novel, because that would be copyright, but it would be like, say, the marketing blurbs. And so the things that I was getting back were very marketing blurby, for want of a better term.
Yeah, one of my students was using it for something to do with coding and sort of like research, and we were talking about how, well, first of all, it's often just bad. I mean, like, stylistically bad or factually bad, right? But also, sort of what I found that when you use it for what you mentioned before, that kind of idea generation, like with a different student, a younger student who was just having trouble kind of brainstorming essentially, and yeah, it just kind of helped this student to kind of come up with a few sort of jumping off points, and that in its that as a sort of the speed of that, you mentioned kind of making people's lives easier, and I think that as a way of sort of starting things off or sort of filling gaps, it kind of works really well. But when it comes to finessing, or when it comes to sort of doing something more, hopefully human, it doesn't yet do so well, I hope.
Yeah. I've been reading some papers on this, just, out of general interest in the technology, and kind of like, there really is this sweet spot where AI can assist us, and it needs to be developed further. It's still at the early days, but I think what's exciting to me about it is the way that it can actually assist a lot of people with, say, disabilities, people who have difficulty communicating, especially, having taught English as a second language, where English might not be your first language, or vice versa. Like I've lived in countries where English is not the first language spoken, and that's been challenging. And being able to communicate effectively using AI is a really exciting thing.
I think it's definitely one of those things that I'm keeping kind of like a close eye on, because yeah, well, obviously, first I don't want them to murder me, but also, yeah, I want to see how I can use it.
I'm less worried about AI. Yeah, I was going to say I'm less worried about the AI coming after me than the people itself. So, I'm more concerned about the human race.
Yeah, we are way scarier than the computers most of the time, which is a kind of a link to your story in INTERZONE 294, which you can get from interzone.press, and your story is The Black Box Killer. And I wondered if you could sort of introduce sort of a little bit about it, and also tell people how it sort of developed, where it came from.
Yeah, I really want to see the reactions to this story, because it is very experimental, and I wrote it after reading a lot of new wave science fiction from the 1960s. So I was actually writing an essay for what ended up being quite an award-winning nonfiction book, Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, which is about the new wave science fiction writers. And I was invited by one of the editors, Andrew Nettie, to write on the very famous editor Judith Merrill. And one of the reasons I absolutely love doing these kind of deep dives into editors and authors' careers and work is because I find them deeply inspiring. And Merrill was a very skilled science fiction writer as well as an editor, and she's probably more famous as an editor, but her writing was also exceptional. But what I did take away, and was one of the things I had to read for it, was England Swings SF, which came out, the year escapes me, but it would have been the 60s. Judith Merrill edited this as a way to bring new wave science fiction to the US market. The US market, the blurbs on it are hilarious. They're basically like, we're not quite sure what this is, but if you don't like it, don't blame us. We've got other books on spaceships over there. It's not a direct quote, but that was the kind of vibe I got.
I should steal that. That's
That's kind of what I like about INTERZONE, is that it's going, like, I appreciate that, because what I've been lamenting a lot, that experimentation of the 1960s is essentially faded away and became part of the mainstream. But after reading this book and reading a lot of the experimental stories from people like Josephine Saxon, J.G. Ballard, and just how bold they were in experimentation and how much of a willingness there was on Merrill's behalf to publish these stories, really challenged my perception of what I should be writing, because I think that there is a kind of what I call the American MFA tradition that's really popular in science fiction magazines, and it's this kind of a kind of clean American style that is very popular. But I lament it in some ways, because I think there's a lack of a willingness to publish experimental work these days. Obviously not by INTERZONE. But I think the challenge to myself was to push my work further and harder. And along with that, I was reading quite a bit of Philip K. Dick at the time, because, Philip K. Dick.
okay.
Because I was actually writing another experimental story which has an experimental narrative, and it's about a photographer in the future. And I've been trying to get that published for a little while. But it's about her coming to terms with climate change as a landscape photographer in the future. And so that all kind of interwove into The Black Box Killer, which I ended up writing as part of Richard Thomas's advanced creative writing course. And I just wanted to write something that everyone was going to either go, what just happened? Or they would be really into it. And I like that. I like being a bit divisive, because I want people to have a strong reaction to my work.
Yeah. And I think once more people have read the story, I think there'll be that reaction, but you're also the way you pull it together, it's not sort of one of these experimental stories where by the end that sort of you're kind of like, what, and you sort of put it down, and there is that kind of what element at lots of moments, but there's also a real sort of closure, and I mean obviously I love it because I'm publishing it, but it is a very very good story.
Thank you. And I think that's important to me too, is that I want to hit this kind of balance of, entertaining the reader. I feel like as a writer, I have some duty to the reader to write something that's going to pull them in, as well as challenge their expectations. And for me, that's a really sweet spot. I don't want to write something that's just navel gazing, and, that's no fun for anybody.
And you mentioned this essay you'd written for that collection. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because I think it did get a lot of exposure, but at the same time, I think there are a lot of people who maybe don't understand quite what that book is. I think it's worth kind of giving a shout out to that.
Yeah, so Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, radical science fiction. I think it's from 1954 to 1980 or something like that. But it was a book conceived in a series of books on pulp by my friend Andrew Neddy and Ian McIntyre. And everyone in the book was invited to write an essay on a specific person in the new wave science fiction movement, or there's a number of really good essays on more of the general movements, such as looking at the impact of the Vietnam War on science fiction in the period. I think what's really important about that book is that I think it's one of the only places where kind of these collected essays on such a wide variety of writers, especially a lot of the Black writers from the period, the queer writers and the feminist writers from that period have been kind of collected into one spot. And that's why it's an important piece, because you can, I think I get a lot of encouragement from reading these stories about people who were bold in the stories that they were telling. And I mean, there's some more famous people in there, like John Wyndham, and I believe there's one on Samuel Delaney, that kind of thing. But there's also people that you might not have heard of. And I really didn't know that much about Judith Merrill before I wrote this essay, and just reading about her life in Damon Knight's The Futurians book and the book she wrote with Emily Paul Weary, which won the Hugo Award, Better to Have Loved. And that's her kind of, again, slightly experimental autobiography. It's written in part by her, part collection of letters, part by her granddaughter. But the fire with which she lived her life and the kind of fire which she fought for social issues, especially on the leftist side of politics, and also the way that she stood by her convictions and moved to Canada because of the war, were really, really interesting to me. And I think it's just encouragement to writers out there. I mean, if you're listening, is to be bold with what you're trying to say about the world and the vision for your work, rather than kind of letting the market necessarily dictate what you write.
Yeah. Bring fire.
I love that. Bring fire. That's the short version.
It's really interesting that you mentioned kind of how those different kind of how different voices got kind of almost clumped together, which is always what happens, right? These labels they kind of, everyone gets pulled in, and then sort of it does, that kind of book really helps to, I think, kind of bring those stories out.
Absolutely. And as someone who follows and is just a big history nerd, I'm really interested in knowing the history of science fiction, where it's come from, and especially from an international perspective as well. I know a reasonable about the history in the US, but looking at different epicenters of where it's developed. One of the things, if you're reading INTERZONE, you'll see some reviews I've done of some fiction that are coming up or just come out. And for me, a big passion of that is, Japanese literature and writing that's coming out of Asia as well, and Australia, because there are a lot of traditions that are outside of the US, and a lot of science fiction, a lot of speculative fiction, weird fiction, that's just not from the States and is really interesting to me. So it's a big passion of mine.
It sounds from what you said so far that your kind of reading interests are very broad, and I kind of get that sense from looking at your Instagram and looking at kind of just looking at your writing as well. Which is how I read. I'm not sort of, I'm kind of like a magpie. Like if something is shiny, I will just pick it up, and it doesn't really, I don't worry too much if it's, like an airport thriller or something which is, really well known. I just pick things up and want to look. And I think that's really, there's something useful about that, but also something really kind of dangerous because it's really expensive. But yeah, in terms of reading, how are you as a reader?
Oh my gosh, I'm hearing the truth spoken. My room that I'm in right now, is full of books, and especially the piles of books that I bought on my summer holiday. And I probably read about 4 or 5 books on the summer holiday and probably bought about 20. So the maths on that is not good. In my favor, I do buy a lot of secondhand op-shop books. But as a reader, I'm always interested in beautiful language and experimentation and things that kind of break away from tropes or cliches. I love an airport thriller. Like, I love thrillers. That's what I actually read a few on my summer break. But for me, I get excited about good language and originality. So it's funny. It could be anything. I'm reading Year 11's The Stepford Wives for my book club, and it arrived yesterday, and I started reading the first page, and I'm just sitting there going, he is such a master of precision. And a lot of the writers from that period, I think Levin's a little later, but Ray Bradbury, I read Something Wicked This Way Comes late last year, and the precision of language is something that I really admire. And I'd rather something that was short and precise than long and languid, unless, you're really skilled. But people who just know how to use words with this kind of effortless poise, and you know it's not effortless. You know that they put so much effort into cutting and refining and getting rid of the dross. But that's something I always really admire in books. But I mean, I'm reading Alan Moore's Illuminations at the moment, and there's stuff that's,
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned
oh
Moore.
God, he's a really big influence on my writing, actually. And in the way that he is experimental, what he does that I really like is that he taps into the mythic. And I mean, there's a reason I've never written Jack the Ripper's story, despite the fact that I actually love Victorian era history and have written 2 books set in the Victorian era. I don't think I'll ever write a Jack the Ripper story because From Hell exists. And the way that taps into the mythology of England and London and the recurring nature of crime in the city over generations is something very influential on me, and something that I think about a lot. And it's probably time for me to revisit From Hell at some point, to the detriment of all the books on my to-read shelf.
Yeah. The they'll have to wait.
What else have I got on there? I've got oh God, I could see them right now, and it's just, I decided to buy all these really fat books as well. So I've got, Orphan Pamuk's Nights of Plague. I've got Stephen King's short story collection, Skeleton Crew. I've got a book on the sewers of Paris. The magpie brain wants to know about the sewers of Paris book. It's funny. I don't know if anyone who's listening is a Thames and Hudson publishing fan, but I'm a really big fan of their picture books. Obviously for adults.
They make pretty books, yeah.
They make pretty books, and Magpie buys them all.
On Alan Moore, the collection is Illuminations, right?
Yeah, and I'd probably say a few short stories in. I do love reading short story collections, but the first story so the first story in Illuminations is kind of set in this lusciously described weird fiction world, the city, and it's about sex workers in the city and a young woman who has essentially her brain severed in order that she can service the magicians and wizards of the city, because they don't want someone who could spill their secrets and their magics to other people. Not necessarily for the reasons that you think, because they, if a spell was kind of recanted wrong to someone else, it could actually be quite disastrous. So she speaks in this kind of fragmentary language. Meanwhile, there's another sex worker who manages to get out as an actress, but has an extraordinarily complicated relationship with the people who still remain. And it's got this kind of, it's tied together by this strange Schrodinger's cat lizard device. And the difficulty I have in describing this story is that what is so remarkable about it is that it's not like anything I've read before. And that's what I admire most when I read something, is the originality of the idea. And, and Moore has a way with words that, no one else does. Mm-hmm. And, it's you can just sit and lounge in that language for a while.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Kevin O'Neill sadly died last year, and Alan Moore published, I think it was on Facebook, but it ended up on Twitter, this sort of poem, this sort of, a kind of memorial, and it was just the language there, and then actually prompted by one of your Instagram posts sort of reminded me about Jerusalem, which had been on one of my kind of back of brain lists, and you talked about how you can you're reading something completely new, and when I started to read Jerusalem, which I'm very, very slowly working through, there's something about just that feeling of reading something which is just completely different. And also what you said earlier about that seamless, that kind of effortless feeling to the prose. And he does that, just remarkably, this sort of being both completely original and seemingly just everything flowing. And obviously it's been edited, or it's gone through these sort of, iterations, but you read it and you cannot see, you cannot see where things join together. It's just sort of all just flowing out.
And I am so envious of that kind of skill, that kind of I guess it's like, surgery where the stitches don't show or the scar heals well. It is a remarkable thing to see from a craft perspective, but as a reader, it's just a pleasure to read. And when I feel like a lot of us readers are always searching for that one book, and we go through so many books and they're fine, or they're better than average, but then you come across one of these gemstones and you're like, this is what reading should be. And I mean, that's the rarefied air of the exceptional author. I mean, Margaret Atwood's one of them I admire very much. You just read a story by her and it's a pleasure. Cormac McCarthy is another writer like that, where I struggle a little bit more with McCarthy, but when he's on fire, I mean, and the way he ends his books, it's just exceptional. And even people like Rinosuke Kutagawa, the Japanese short story author, who in his very short life wrote better short stories than I will probably ever produce. And this is another thing that really impresses me when people write with kind of a level of nuance and they manage to pull it off. There's that kind of double meaning that's often in Japanese short stories, where Kutagawa does this so magnificently well, where yes, you can read this short story at surface level, but there's a second undercurrent that's saying something about the world that's running underneath that. And when that's done well, it's kind of like solving a puzzle box. You just see all the pieces come out. And for me, I do like work that is constructed. I like to see that someone has put effort into the construction of the story, but I don't necessarily want to see the scaffold. I like things that dovetail. I like things that, I love things that use the title on the last 2 pages and you're like, that's where that comes from. Whereas some people might not like that. It's just the kind of thing I admire.
I like that puzzle box metaphor and that kind of hearing, particularly with short stories, where you kind of whether it's very conscious right then or whether it's afterwards, but you hear that click and it's like, okay, right, sort of it's all fallen into place. That's remarkable. And
short stories are challenging. You've got a limited amount of space to do that in, and that's the challenge of the short story. But also, I think that, coming back to that point on experimentation, short stories are the place for that, because it's harder to sustain an experimental narrative over the space of a novel. But a short story is a good length for that weirdness.
Moving on from that, I saw that you had a massive sheaf of paper in a photo. I think that was also Instagram, and it was your novel, which was kind of getting ready for edits on paper, which I think is really cool. But yeah, can you talk a little bit about that, or is it super top secret?
Well, it's actually, I mean, I am actually looking at getting feedback from my beta readers right now. So I'm taking a little break from the novel. It's a 19th century necromancy novel, which I'm pitching as Good Omens meets Jonathan Strange. So offbeat British humour, the norm. And it's... I actually write a lot darker fiction. So if you read Black Box Killer, it's a little grim. There's serial killers. There's a totalitarian kind of post-apocalyptic state. But this book was the book I wanted to write for me as the kind of hug I needed in the pandemic. So this was kind of, written as a book that I wanted to read to give me comfort. And so there's romance, and it's still very goth. I mean, it's like Wednesday Addams was a necromancer with a talking cat. But, I poured my kind of heart and soul into this book, and I'll actually be going out to look for agents in hopefully March or April with this big chonker of 90,000 words, which will likely get another 10,000 words after feedback, I suspect. But I really hope that people, when they do read it, that they just get that same sense of comfort and joy and whimsy and, a little bit of the, grim skeletal nature of being a necromancer as well.
I mean, you've pitched it really, really well. You mentioned before, you mentioned before about when we were preparing for this pod about Megan, and I wondered if you could sort of talk a bit about that, because I haven't seen it. I've seen the trailer. It's one of those trailers where I kind of feared that have I been shown too much in the trailer, or are these all the best bits? But yeah, do you have anything any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, speaking of highbrow and lowbrow tastes, I mean, I'll go from, some sort of literary endeavor to going to see, as we say in Australia, Megan, but I realize it's called Megan everywhere else. But I try to go to the films every week on a Friday night, and I had the choice between Banshees of Inisherin and Megan, and I was like, I'm really not in the mood for Banshees. I know I'm going to be like distraught by the end of it. So we saw this film, and it's got this real kind of RoboCop meets Chucky vibe to it. It's really funny. It could have been terrible, but it's actually quite brilliant, and it lands in the places you expect, but the script is entertaining. It's about, obviously, a capitalist toy manufacturer that's always trying to create the newest and bestest toys without thinking of the ethical implications of those things, which is, of course, why they make a sentient doll who obviously exceeds the bounds of her programming. And look, they're pretty light on the programming details, but clearly this is what happens in movies. When you make a robot, they're not just going to stay and do what they're told. And it does have similarities with the excellent Ex Machina, but it's a hell of a lot funnier. And you're kind of rooting for her as well, because she's just doing some of the things that we all kind of want to do. She's just going ahead and saying them. And she becomes obviously best friends with this girl who's grieving, and her aunt, who is the toy maker. And, she has some learning to do about personal relationships as well. But it's just the way it goes about it. It's a hell of a lot of fun. It's really sassy. There's some great music cues in it. I'm not spoiling too much by saying, having a doll-like android singing Titanium as a lullaby is probably one of the highlights of the film. Okay. But I think if you're looking for a laugh and you kind of want to get away from the grimness of the usual Oscar season, Megan is certainly worth your time.
So Megan, which is out now, and sort of like you mentioned how you had that choice in the cinema between, do I see this, which is going to kind of leave me traumatized, or do I see this, which is basically going to be entertaining? And the same, I think, with reading. What are you reading at the moment, kind of just to kind of decompress, just to kind of chill out to? What kind of books are your comfort reads?
Oh, that's a very good question. Actually, I did just read a thriller called The Ice about a serial killer at the North Pole. And look, I was really sucked in by the marketing blurb. I'm like, how can you say no to serial killer at the North Pole? Sure. It did hit all the notes. I mean, and look, it's probably going to be a great Scandi noir TV show at some point. The book I read recently, which was a bit of comfort reading, was Good Omens. I read that over Christmas. I think when I'm looking for something to kind of get out of my head, I certainly do turn to crime, or I turn to romance. I read romance novels. I haven't read one for a while because I've been doing a lot of reading for my own kind of studies of craft and reviewing. But I call myself genre agnostic. I like most things that are genre fiction, and I'll give anything a go as long as it's well written. The other comfort read I adore is Red, White, and Royal Blue. I think if I'm feeling particularly down, I've read that book twice, and I just sit there for an afternoon and read the whole thing in one hit, and it is pure delight. And I don't know if you know much about it, but it's the story of the first son of obviously the President of the United States falling in hate with the Prince of England, and has everything I love about it. So, yeah, it's a great one.
Thank you very much for talking to me today, and hopefully you can come back on and we can talk about some of the things we haven't discussed.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gareth. I am really thrilled to have this story in INTERZONE, and I just encourage all of you lovely listeners to go and read it. There's nothing better for a writer to hear someone's enjoyed their work. So, if you didn't like it, engage with it as well. I kind of am really passionate about people having strong reactions. So I'm keen to hear what you think.
Yeah, no, I can't wait to see. I can't wait to see what people say.
And just a final shout out to Dave Zenekel for the amazing artwork in this story. It really captured the vibe of this. And if you haven't seen this story yet, I mean, it's a redaction story. It's beautifully designed. I cannot wait to see the print edition, because I think it's actually something that I wrote with the intention of being put in print. So I'm thrilled that it's going in print.
Thanks so much, Kat. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I'll and please follow INTERZONE Pod wherever you follow podcasts. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple, we're on Google, and we have an RSS feed if you do it the way it should be done. Thank you for listening. See you next time. Bye bye.